By July it had reached sub-Saharan Africa, with infected sailors who arrived at the ports. It entered West Africa from ships arriving in Freetown, Sierra Leone. It infected Eastern Africa via the port in Mombasa, Kenya. Ships arriving into Cape Town set the virus loose in South Africa. From these ports, influenza ripped its way across the continent, devastating the population. By July, it had also reached Peru and begun spreading across South America. By August, it had returned to North America. By October, it had reached New Zealand and Japan. By November, a lethal outbreak was surging across Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. Despite quarantines on ships entering port, dock restrictions, and a concerted effort at containment, it finally spread into Australia by 1919. In less than a year, the deadly flu had surged around the world. The flu was able to spread so efficiently for many reasons, including the movement of vast companies of troops around the world, and the conditions those troops were living in. World War I was desperately brutal, and trench warfare made for horrific living conditions and for the perfect breeding ground for disease. Men lived out in the open, with no protection from the freezing winter, the pounding rain, or the sweltering sun. Troops at the front lines lived in filthy trenches for months at a time, where they had to eat, sleep, and answer all the calls of nature within close contact with each other. When it rained, the trenches filled up with water that became rank and foul as it had nowhere to drain. Men's feet rotted in their boots, a condition called trench foot. Dead bodies lay decomposing in no man's land between the two armies. When it rained, water would wash excrement, decomposing body parts, and filth down into the trenches where the men lived. Constant bombing churned up the dirt and turned the ground into a sloppy swamp. The mud became so bad that in some places it was like quicksand. Planks were laid down for the men to walk on. There were cases of horses, pack mules, and even soldiers slipping off the walkways and drowning in the mud before they could struggle out of their heavy gear. By the end of the war, over 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians would die in the war. Thus, it's not surprising that when a virulent new virus arrived, it became an even more deadly foe than the enemy soldiers. At some point, in the summer of 1918, the flu mutated to become more deadly. It gave some people the normal symptoms of fever, chills, nausea, aches, and diarrhea, and many got sick, then recovered like a normal flu. Some were sick longer or died after catching a secondary infection, such as pneumonia. However, many people became violently ill with strange symptoms. In fact, in the July 1918 edition of the medical journal The Lancet, doctors argued that this strange epidemic couldn't be the flu because the symptoms didn't fit. Italian doctors argued the same. In some people, Spanish flu caused fevers that were so high people hallucinated. Some writhed in agonized muscle pain so bad that doctors thought they had dengue, also called breakbone fever. It made some people temporarily or even permanently blind, deaf, or paralyzed. Some lost the ability to smell. Some had strong vertigo and would fall over if they tried to walk. Extreme ear infections developed very quickly, going from the first pain to the eardrums rupturing within only a few hours. Some had terrible headaches and double vision. Severe mucus excretions and inflammation made it hard for victims to breathe. Some people coughed so hard they tore their abdominal muscles. Doctors doing autopsies saw lungs so damaged that they resembled those of people who died from poisonous gas in the war. Some people developed a symptom most physicians had never seen before. Tiny puffs of air would leak out from tears in the lungs and get trapped beneath the skin, puffing up in little pockets all over their bodies. When they moved, the pockets would crackle like a bowl of Rice Krispies, according to one nurse. Some people developed hemorrhagic fever, which, like Ebola, causes its victims to bleed. An Army report described the flu as a rapidly escalating infection and lungs choked with blood, fatal in from 24 to 48 hours. Some people bled from their nose, their ears, and their eyes. Some people with the 1918 flu became so oxygen-starved they began to turn blue, or even looked black, a condition called cyanosis. People reportedly turned so dark that it was difficult to distinguish white people from people of color. For this reason, the flu picked up the nickname the Blue Death, and many wondered if the Black Death had returned. When people began turning blue, doctors knew they wouldn't survive more than a few hours. The flu was also terrifying because it could kill so quickly. Many victims died within a day or two, or even hours of showing their first symptoms. According to a story recounted in the book The Great Influenza, a man in Cape Town, South Africa, boarded a streetcar just as the conductor died. During the 3-mile ride to his house, 6 more people on the streetcar died. When the driver died, he got off the streetcar and walked home. We've had a number of cases where people were perfectly healthy and died within 12 hours. Charles Edward Winslow, epidemiologist and professor at Yale University. In late summer of 1918, the flu virus returned to America, but this time it was far more deadly. In August, a ship full of sick people arrived in New York City from Europe. 4 men had already died at sea, and 200 more people on the ship were sick. Many were taken to hospitals, but they weren't quarantined. In the following week, several more ships full of sick people arrived. The same was happening in other deep-water ports, like Boston, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. At the same time as the virus was arriving and spreading in ports, ships left those same ports headed for Canada, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, carrying infected people. In early September, there was an outbreak at Navy Pier in Boston. The pier was quarantined, but officers still moved between bases. An officer was probably responsible for carrying the flu to nearby Camp Devens. At first, just a few men reported sick, and then within only a few days an epidemic broke out. By mid-September, thousands of men were sick, in many cases violently so. Of those who were sick, 75% were so ill they had to be hospitalized. The sheer number of patients overwhelmed the medical staff at the military hospital. The hospital had been designed to treat a maximum of 1,200 troops at one time, yet more than 6,000 patients were crammed in. Cots were stuffed into every available space, in hallways and offices, even on outdoor porches. The doctors and nurses fell ill. There were simply not enough healthy people to care for the thousands of sick people. So many died that they couldn't all fit in the hospital morgue. The dead were stacked up one on top of another, like firewood in the hallway outside the morgue. Every day they were carted away, and every day the hall filled up again. The Army medical officers issued an order that no men should be sent to or shipped out of Camp Devens. However, that's not what happened. A group of officers left Camp Devens, headed to Camp Grant in Illinois. Despite the rules against it, the chief officer there had authorized overcrowding due to a shortage in barracks, once again giving the ideal environment for the disease to spread. Shortly after arriving, the officers from Camp Devens became sick. The men were quarantined, but it was already too late. Within 2 days of the first cases, the flu was widespread throughout the camp. Within 4 days of the first case, men started dying. Within 5 days, doctors and nurses became sick and started dying. By 6 days, there were 4,000 men admitted to the hospital, and they converted 10 barracks into temporary hospitals. By 7 days, they were running out of medicine, disinfectant, and other medical supplies. By 9 days, they converted 9 more barracks to serve as hospitals, bringing the number up to 20. They didn't have enough beds, sheets, or ambulances to carry all the infirm. When they ran out of beds, soldiers were ordered to stuff straw into sacks to use as mattresses for the sick. They still didn't have enough. They tried to make enough face cloths to cover people's mouths to fight the spread of germs, but they ran out of cloth. The Red Cross set up a station to notify relatives that their loved ones were dying or dead. Now relatives poured into the midst of a deadly epidemic. Healthy relatives were escorted by coughing service members to identify dead bodies in the morgue. They crowded into the overfilled hospitals to visit ill loved ones. Desperate parents and wives tried to bribe nurses and orderlies to give special care to their soldier. It became such a problem that the head officer issued a warning about accepting bribes. Those relatives would leave the camp and carry the infection out into the civilian community, into local towns, onto cross-country trains, and ultimately back to their own hometowns. Civilian health officials called for an emergency quarantine of Camp Grant, but the virus was already out. 4 days after the first reported case, a trainload of troops had left Camp Grant to go cross-country to Camp Hancock near Augusta, Georgia. For the journey of almost 1,000 miles, the men were packed tightly into train cars with poor ventilation. In the tight quarters, men coughed, became feverish, and began bleeding from their eyes and ears. They infected each other swiftly, and the virus swept along the train. The train stopped repeatedly along the journey to refuel, and the men who could still walk got off the train to get a break from the hacking coughs of the sick and delirious men. There they interacted with railroad workers and curious locals who had come to see the troops. They infected town after town for almost 1,000 miles. When they finally arrived in Georgia, 2,000 of the 3,000 men were so sick they needed to be hospitalized immediately. They started a new outbreak at Camp Hancock. Historians don't know how many of the men from the train died, but one report from Fort Leonard Wood claims 10%. Yet when hundreds began dying, the medical staff at the hospital stopped keeping careful records. They were just too overwhelmed by all the dead. One robust person showed the first symptoms at 4:00 p.m. and died by 10:00 a.m. The Journal of the American Medical Association. The same thing would happen at bases across America. At Camp Custer in Michigan, 2,800 troops reported sick in a single day.